Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful day here in Christ University, Bangalore. It's February 20th, 2020. On February 19th and 20th, we had an international conference on visual cultures in context, affect, subversion, and resistance, organized by the Department of Media Studies, Christ University, in collaboration with Center for Performance Research and Culture Studies in South Asia. And we had in our midst Professor Laura Mulvey from Birkbeck, Department of Film, Media and Culture Studies, University of London. Ma'am has been an amazing presence here, and we are delighted to have this conversation with us. And let me also introduce my fellow interviewer, Professor Arya Ayyappan, and we would be in conversation with Professor Laura Mulvey. So let me invite Arya ma'am to start the conversation.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for having me here.
It's indeed our honor that you are here with us.
Yes.
So, I'll start with the very first idea that completely changed the way in which people have approached the medium of visual culture. So, if you were to revisit the idea of visual pleasure across time in terms of both film production and film viewing, the politics of it, how would you look into that?
A lot has changed since 1975 when that essay was first published. But I think I should start by going back to the particular circumstances in which I wrote it. In those days, people all still went to the cinema, sat as an audience in a darkened room, looked up at the silver screen, and became absorbed in the spectacle they saw in front of them. So I had spent a long time just going to the cinema myself, loving the cinema, particularly interested in Hollywood. And then, at the early 70s, I encountered the women's liberation movement. And the films that I'd watched with so much pleasure, with such absorption, suddenly I started seeing them with different eyes. My own experience of spectatorship changed. And instead of an absorbed spectator, I became a critical spectator who sat back, looked at the film, and said to myself, what is this? This is exploitative. This woman is being shown as a spectacle for the active gaze of the protagonist on the screen, and that gaze is carried into the spectators in the auditorium. Now, seeing that my experience had been very much one of absorption into the language of the film, my first premise was that the spectator was not gendered, because the language of the film assumed a masculinity of spectatorship. Whoever you were in the audience, you were absorbed into this position. Unless, of course, you sat back, thought, what's going on here? Now, you could take those different positions, very much according perhaps to what your gendered engagement was. If you were watching perhaps as a gay spectator, you might watch differently. I didn't actually, at the time, take those different nuances into account, because I wanted to write an essay that was a manifesto, that was a polemic. So, looking back over the years, I see it as something that stands on its own with a political strength, one that lacked nuances, one that's irritated people down the years for the lack of recognition of the complexities of spectatorship, but one which perhaps was all I could write at the time. That was the way I had to approach it then. Also, I wasn't writing in an academic context. I was writing in a political context. It was a politics of spectatorship. And I think perhaps that was the break that the essay made with previous ways of addressing film.
Yes. Yes. Sure.
In fact, perhaps this is one of the most quoted and referred to texts that we come across in film studies. And there are a lot of contestations about what you had initiated. One is that it was a subjective kind of a response to the cinematic engagement, and that it was not informed by field research, by talking to the audience. Would you like to tell us whether is that a requirement, or should there be a combination of the subjective reading of the experience and that of the field experience?
All research is important.
Yeah.
As I said, the context was really one in which the politics was almost more important than film. So as to make the statement as a feminist political statement was more important than the nuances of the research. And I think that over the years, the positions that I worked out then have been considerably more nuanced. But I sometimes think this might seem paradoxical or even a bit bizarre. It was the lack of academic depth to the essay that gave it, in a sense, a political, even a kind of emotional depth. The fact that I say things like, the aim, people say that analyzing beauty destroys it. The aim of this essay is to do precisely that. So there were polemical statements, and it was written very carefully in a rhetorical style, which is one of the reasons why I think it's perhaps lasted this ridiculously long period of time down the decades, that we're still talking about it today in February 2020, and it might have had something to do with the style with which it was written, also perhaps to do with the fact that that kind of position on film hadn't been taken up before then.
Interestingly, that set off a lot of more focused engagement with the spectatorial engagement with the cinematic text. I'm just curious why this term spectator is still so much in operation. For instance, the word privileges the visual engagement in contrast to, let's say, the word audience, which means the auditory engagement is of significance. While audio-visual is the format in which we engage with the film, the visual part seems to be privileged in the way we refer to it. Would you like to share your thoughts on that?
I think the concept of the audience refers much more to a social entity, and brings in sociological contexts. And a number of scholars down the years have introduced those kinds of questions to the social makeup of the audience. And once again, I was focusing on the concept of the spectator, partly because I was influenced by Freud. So I was imposing a specific reading in which the spectator was absorbed into a concept of active spectatorship, in which the object of his, and I emphasize his at this point, gaze was reduced to a state of passivity. Of course, Freud thought that the psychic makeup of the human unconscious was more complicated than that. But it seemed to me that in a strange way, Hollywood cinema had, as it were, taken the Freudian picture and turned it into almost a cliche of masculine, active, female, passive, and that was transferred by the language of cinema itself to the spectator, who I encapsulated in a sense as a body and as a gaze, particularly interested in the way that the way of looking of that characterized the male spectator on the screen absorbed the spectators in the auditorium. But I think it's important to point out that alongside my thinking here, and I mentioned this in the text, I assumed what we might call a heteronormative taboo, that for the society at the time, the idea of the male body as an object of beauty and as an object of gaze would demasculinize the figure. It would make the figure of the male effeminate. because he would be put in a position of object of the gaze. So even at moments when you see your beautiful male movie star exhibited perhaps for a second for the enjoyment of the spectator, often it's quickly followed by a moment of vigorous activity, fisticuffs, something to reassert the essential masculinity of the protagonist,
Right.
and his drive over the development of the story.
This is interesting because this is one of the ways in which we do manifest that in the Indian cinema context as well, especially in the popular cinema format. We do get to see that very clearly. Now that you've brought in the idea of the spectator and the spectatorship, and one of the central ideas in your work was the problematizing the whole notion of male gaze.
Yes.
And following that, there were a lot of talks and discussions on the idea of female gaze.
Yeah.
Now, over the years, we can see three trajectories of thought which have
Yes.
become quite popular, but in a way contesting one another. One is that female gaze is the woman behind the camera. Another one says that female gaze refers to the female protagonist on screen, looking at the male character in a very romantic manner. Third one talks about the female on screen, or the woman on screen, looking at the male protagonist in a very lustful manner.
Oh, right.
What is your
I get
take
it.
on
Yes.
the idea of...
I would add another one,
Okay.
but I'll
Okay.
come to that in a moment.
Definitely.
The most important, perhaps, from our perspective and within history, is the woman behind the camera.
Okay.
It seems to me that the way of seeing that we might associate with women directors is to search for, explore, investigate women's stories and women's experiences, which are not so much to do with relations of power.
Okay.
There isn't this desperate sense that, as it were, that masculinity needs to be protected, come what may.
Okay.
There's an easier sense of exploration. Perhaps I should also say that in visual pleasure narrative cinema, I'm not talking about cinema altogether. I'm talking about a particular kind of industrial and commercial cinema in which the star system itself, gender binaries, is of the essence. There are other kinds of cinemas, but the cinema with the woman behind the camera would explore different kinds of topics, and just without going into it much further, we need more of it,
Right.
Yes.
and much, much more of it. Over the years, not nearly enough women are
Yeah.
telling women's stories and allowing women's stories to be absorbed into our general shared culture, not just part of women's culture, but taking women's experience and turning them into part of our collective understanding of our world and how we are in it. So that, I think, is very important. I've always rather resisted the sense that there might be a female gaze that reverses or takes on the male gaze, because my argument around the male gaze is that it's a position of power which is imposed on someone else.
Yes.
So it involves an active, passive, a position of power and a position of lack of power.
Okay.
So politically, do we necessarily want to just reverse this
Okay.
and have, as it were, a female gaze that imposes power on someone else? On the other hand, I feel that there are films in which an element of satire, comedy, or parody can creep in, and the female gaze can become a kind of critical axis which actually exposes the absurdity of this binary position. So within those kinds of situations of turning the world upside down, as it were, those moments in which the most oppressed take on the position of mastery,
Right.
that those kind of situations of carnival, I feel that it's an interesting idea to explore. But for me, over the years, trying to figure out what happens to the woman as obviously an investigator of her world, what kind of look can this be which is not necessarily associated with questions of power? And so, just thinking about legend, mythology, certain kinds of literary tropes, I began to think about the question of curiosity and the way that women have been associated with a curious gaze, which I elevated a little bit to seeing with the mind's eye.
Yeah.
So to think about legends of curiosity and how that might fit with ideas of decipherment and how women might be interested in solving riddles and reading puzzles rather than imposing a position of power on the world. And so it's also to emphasize the way in which our world is in many ways obscure to us, and that kind of investigation, partly political, but partly also poetic, perhaps, because I think one should always remember that there's an element of, as it were, the poetic comes in here, and the poetic and the political can, as it were, inform each other. And to think about the long traditions of women's curiosity, moving perhaps into detective stories.
Okay. Yes.
Angela, famous women detectives,
Right.
Miss Marple,
Miss Marple.
etc., etc.,
Yeah.
etc.
Okay.
I also think one last point on this is that when I wrote the visual pleasure essay in 75, I overemphasized the place of the camera within the whole gamut, as it were, of the cinematic apparatus.
Okay.
And there's much more to the cinema than just the look of the camera. But because I was particularly concerned with spectatorship, I, in a sense, overestimated the power of the look of the camera. So I make the three looks: the look of the camera on the scene, the look of the protagonist that's recorded within the scene, and the look of the spectator. There's more to cinema
Yep.
than just camera.
Just,
It's a very, very complex medium, and to overemphasize that side of it is, in a sense, to leave out the complexities of editing,
yes.
the
Yes.
complexities
Yes.
of mise en scène.
Yes.
And just to put on record, in that old essay, the first part was about voyeurism, scopophilia, the camera, etc. The second part, which generally gets overlooked, was about what I called a fetishistic approach to the screen, in which the look of the camera is, in a sense, dispersed behind, not behind, but dispersed into the screen itself
Okay.
as a site of fascination, where the fascinating image of the woman is exposed as fascinating, but the male gaze is absent, and it's much more an image of diffusion and light and shade, where the spectacle becomes one of the specificity of the cinematic itself. Sometimes I think perhaps I wanted to save the cinema I loved so much
Okay.
from total voyeurism, and that this was a way of kind of thinking around
Right.
in other ways. And recently I've gone back to thinking a little bit about the screen as site of fascination and displacing the camera. a certain amount.
I'm just curious about how this storytelling as a process and the feminist kind of intervention come together in cinema, because there are of course a lot of stories that are untold, unheard, and there is a need for sharing them. And do you believe that for the feminist cause, cinema becomes an ideal medium to articulate those set of concerns, considering that cinema is a composite art form as well? It's not
Yes.
just one, and it brings in a lot, gives
Yes.
more holistic uh, approach to the
Yes.
process. And do you think cinema lends itself for the feminist cause more than, let's say, the other?
I wouldn't say more than other
Okay,
arts. That's too.
Okay.
But that's too much of a hostage to fortune.
Okay.
What I think I would say is that the cinema has been stereotyped. I mean,
Okay.
I stereotyped it in the ways that we've been discussing just now, but it's also been stereotyped in that it's been so often associated with a linear temporality
Yes.
and with a narrative drive around cause and effect, affected, as we were saying earlier, by a male protagonist. And you find film scholars who say essentially the cinema is linear. That, I think, is a fundamental misunderstanding of the flexibility of the form. And if we think about the alternative ways in which the cinematic narrativity has been configured over the years, going back, right back to the experimental films of the 1920s, something like Ziegler Verthoff's Man with a Movie Camera, the experiments of that period, later experiments of experimental film, we actually discover another cinema in which time and temporality opens out. And here I think I would risk a hostage to fortune, that the cinema can open up time in a way that perhaps the other arts can't. And it can bring together irreconcilables that are almost beyond the reach of the human mind. For instance, cinema, we're going back now to the old days of celluloid. The cinema was one 25 frames a second, one
24.
instant when the film frame paused in front of the camera lens. But as it was transferred into film itself, that instant becomes sequence and duration. So that in film, there's always the possibility of playing with instant and duration.
Yes.
And many great filmmakers have brought out that paradox by finding a freeze frame moment, which of course isn't a single image, it's a number of still images,
Right.
but it reminds us of the essential temporal paradox on which the cinema is built. Also, the cinema can be slowed in a way, again, which is contrary to the possibilities of human life and human imagination. But the cinema brings those possibilities into being. So I would say that the cinema opens up to us questions of time and temporality and faces us with them in a way that perhaps other art forms don't.
Okay.
Now,
And I could talk a bit more about this,
Yes.
But we can come back to it
Yes.
later.
Yes.
in connection with what Sir has just asked, there is your own engagement with the idea of counter cinema.
Yes.
So how would you talk about that particular experience as a filmmaker yourself and as a woman filmmaker?
Yes. When I started making films with my collaborator, Peter Wallen, our first principle, as you mentioned just now, was a counter-cinema. So the origin of our aesthetic approach was perhaps a negativity, and in the years just before we started making films, I'd written Visual Pleasure, a narrative cinema. Peter Wallen had written an essay on late Godard which was about counter cinema, in which he laid down one cardinal virtues of mainstream cinema, the cardinal virtues of counter cinema. And so, in a sense, those principles were where we started from. And in our first instance, we wanted to disperse the way in which the conventions of continuity editing had, as it were, sewn spectatorship into into narrative continuum and into the position of spectatorship from the screen into the auditorium. So our films, we called them at the beginning Return to Zero, Scorched Earth, had a polemical position against editing. So we shot with very long and extended takes. In the next film, we modified this a little bit, and our films were always hybrid. We avoided the purities of modernism and looked for bringing all different kinds of discourses into our films. And so, for instance, in the second film, there's a story in the middle about a young mother and her relationship with her 2-year-old daughter. And the 13 shots, the tableau, were each shot with a circular camera movement, a 360-degree pan. So once again, it was a negation of editing, but it was more complex, more poetic, more resonant, and so on.
Okay.
That's great. So now that you have spoken about your own experience as a filmmaker and understanding how the medium has changed over a period of time from the celluloid to the digital, and with your take on Death 24 frames a second, how do you see the change from the very idea of a possessive spectator that we talk about right now as against the earlier idea of a pensive spectator? So if you could just clarify in terms of how you visualize the entire idea.
Well, once again, to be autobiographical, as I explained, it was my experience of my own spectatorship shifting under the influence of the women's movement and feminism. And then in, say, kind of late 80s, 90s, first with VHS, but then more with the coming of DVDs, I started to look at films differently. And I have to emphasize that this wasn't an experience of, say, viewing a film that was unfamiliar and that I didn't know. This was, and I think this is an important part of the experience of temporality here. It was very often going back to films that I'd loved in the past, even exploring the Hollywood films that I'd taken a polemical stand against, looking at them again, but this time with an interactive spectatorship in which the little thingamajig, the remote control, the spectator could start exploring these questions of temporality within the film. The spectator could discover instant sequence. It could discover slow motion. It could discover a poignant, emotional interaction, a gesture, an exchange of looks which had perhaps been previously invisible. But in addition to this, I felt that in the old days when we sat in the cinema and we watched the movie unwind in front of us, there was a way in which it was always going too fast. The spectator always wanted to hold on to something, to grasp a precious moment, which perhaps is why a kind of culture of the still grew, and fandom grew around the movies, so that in addition to going to the movies, you would have your favourite movie star, pictures, stills, and so on. So that interest in holding on to the image, the physical image, the image of the favourite body, instead of it having to be just an extra that you put up in your bedroom, as it were, you could hold on to that body and explore it as you pause the film itself. And in the course of doing this, I realised that the interactive spectator could become a kind of very complexly gendered spectator, so that the previously taboo figure of the beautiful male movie star could then be held for contemplation and for enjoyment, exposed, as it were, for the female gaze, the gay gaze, whatever you like. So I was interested in the way in which two things were happening at the same time, and which, as it were, exchanged places. One, there was the possessive spectator who wanted to hold on to the instant, hold on to the body, but then in the process of doing that, this is my imagination, of course, this is how I imagined it working, would start to think, why is this image the way it is? How is it constructed out of a certain composition of light, shade, camera position? What makes it beautiful cinematically, as well as it were, possessively? So I felt that there was always that kind of investigation. A pensive spectator would then start to disrupt the possessive spectator, but then perhaps the possessive spectator would reassert itself, and there was an exchange of positions. So there was a way in which thinking about the cinema would emerge out of emotional engagement with it. And I was just interested in the way that those two things were possible to hold, two positions were possible to hold almost simultaneously, to think and to enjoy, as it were.
It's interesting how you look at the notion of time in the cinematic context. One is, of course, as a medium, it lends itself for tampering with time. Unlike, let's say, reality, wherein we'll have to go with the clockwork mechanism, whereas in a fictional narrative context, we can relive yesterday many a time, or have today multiple times, or visit tomorrow today. So the range of possibilities that narrative time allows is amazing. On the other hand, cinema, particularly as a narrative platform, lends a lot of other advantages. For instance, you talk about how change and continuity have a different kind of an approach in a cinematic framework in contrast to that of, let's say, photography.
Yes.
Right? So there is this possibility. And in our context of the recent times, you were talking about the DVD having come in and changed the whole consumption process, and then also how the remote control is adding to the whole spectatorial engagement in a different way. All that is there. So, of course, now I can watch the film according to my own convenience. I can decide whether to review one particular part of it many a times or skip a certain part. That possibility is there, and that's something that you've written about. On the other hand, there is also the possibility of flipping channels and watching different films.
Oh.
So how do you look at this aspect? So I can pause one for a while and then go to another one and then come back to this, especially the computer screen and the way in which we can engage with different things.
That's very fascinating.
Yeah.
I haven't yet experimented with that.
Okay.
So, PK, I'm going to take that away with me and experiment in that in honour of this particular conversation.
Sure.
But I do think the point that you made about time means that we can come back again to this question of time, because the pensive spectator is then also brought into thinking about time itself, time and its passing. So, in a sense, moves out of the narrative dimension into perhaps a more historical dimension, and that the pause on the still image can also, in a sense, take us back to the indexical moment in which the film itself was shot. so that when you see a favorite movie star, when paused, it can become more like a document and you see more a documentary, which, as it were, preserves the moment in which the film was being made, so that the accoutrements of narrative fall away, and that kind of indexical instant which the narrative film always wants to repress and suppress kind of comes into a new visibility. So I think there are multiple ways in which this happens. But I was also interested in coming back to the question of history, in the particular historical conjuncture in which I was perhaps frivolously looking at my favourite films through the new old favourite films through new technology, was also a time when history was in a sense being swept aside, and the current ideology was trying to forget the past and to invent a new world, which would be a digital world in which old technologies no longer had a place. And it seemed to me that there was a way in which the new technology could actually keep the old alive, and that rather than one sweeping the other away, the new could actually give us new insights into and a new relationship to the old, and it could allow us to preserve the preciousness of the old. So perhaps this was just a metaphor in which preserving the preciousness of old celluloid film was a metaphor for the importance of preserving, of keeping links, say, with our progressive pasts, at a moment when neoliberalism was denying that the progressive past had any hold on the present. It was perhaps a metaphor, but it was also keeping alive that sense that there was a continuum between, or rather than a continuum, a dialogue, a dialectical relationship, to put it perhaps more grandly, that one could find between the old and the new.
So, ma'am, while we were talking about your own films that you were making, so could you tell us, after some point of time, there was a set of films that you made which marked a move from your earlier films, and why you stopped making the kind of films that you were making with Peter Wollen?
With Peter Wollen. The films that I made, that Peter and I made, really belong to a very advantageous moment in the 1970s, when there was a very strong movement of independent film in the UK at the time. It wasn't just manifested in the films that were made, but also in a very flourishing film culture, writing, journals, magazines, symposia, film festivals, the Edinburgh Film Festival, Screen Magazine, the independent filmmakers organising themselves into an association, and dialogue between the most extreme artists' films and, at the other end, agit films, left collectives. So we were all, in a way, in a dialogue together. And we also had support from the British Film Institute and the Arts Council. I think I've always put this in this particular way. It's become almost a cliche in my discussions. With the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, we saw two things happening. One was a bad thing, and one was a good thing, better thing. The bad thing was in 1979, the election of our first woman Prime Minister, which changed the cultural atmosphere very suddenly. It was quite a sharp break. So Peter Wollen's and my next film, Crystal Gazing, was in a sense immediately in the early 80s a reflection on unemployment, disillusion, depression, the loss of that utopian aspiration that we'd had in the 1980s. And also, very, very quickly, the films that were supported by the state had to show value for money. Value for money in Riddles of the Sphinx? No. No, not at all. So a change of ideology came over the whole of the art scene. Um, so that was disillusioning. On the other hand, what I might say was the good thing, the better thing, was in 1982, our fourth television channel came on air, Channel 4, which had written into the bill as it went through Parliament that the new channel had to be innovative and educational. And actually, our independent film sector had lobbied very, very hard for this to take place. So there was a bit of continuity across the 70s movement into Channel 4. But for me, working with television was not the same. It involved professionalization. The last film we made, The Bad Sister, was really quite a big production that we shot on 1-inch video. And the process of collaboration changes in those circumstances. So, in a sense, Peter's and my collaboration came to an end. He went on to make his very brilliant film Friendship's Death in '86. And I felt that my filmmaking career had come to an end. I was no longer interested. I saw no easy outlet. And I went back to thinking about the earlier questions of women in film, and that was when I collected the essays together for Fetishism and Curiosity. So it was a kind of break and a change of direction in my career.
But definitely your filmmaking career did not come to an end. You continued with Disgraced Monuments, and you also continued with 23rd August and all of that. So how do you see there's a marked shift from your earlier take on feminist film and women's concerns towards moving to a more political aspects that you were looking into as well?
To a certain extent, there's an element of chance here. Both films were made in collaboration with my friend Mark Lewis, who's an artist, Canadian artist, and he was working with an organization in Toronto called Public, which was about campaigning to get artists' work in public space. And in association with that, he became interested in the idea of public monuments. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, as the monuments of the old Soviet regime and the communist regimes across Eastern Europe started to come down, he was interested in how history disgraces monuments at certain moments of critical political change. So that the idea that the ordinary population in everyday life has walked past these monuments for years and forgotten about them, but suddenly they take on a new visibility and they become a site of performance and ritual with the kind of demontage of the pieces. So, and he asked me, I think I said to him, perhaps you could make a documentary about this. And he said, well, I'll only do it if you do it with me. So we found ourselves in the last days of the Soviet Union, not experts on the history, but just looking rather as outsiders on how people were reacting to these questions. And here again, there was a strong sense there that it was important to keep some dialogue, some discussion from the old days of the Soviet period into whatever was happening in the future. So a lot of the intellectuals that we talked to, artists and so on, felt that the monuments could be placed within a context, but to just pull them down and eradicate them was repeating mistakes that the Soviet regime itself had made over years in repressing moments of history that were not liked, so that the new moment of history should be able to accept the continuums and the breaks of history in cultural dialogue. So that was the idea of the film. And also we got support from Channel 4, so it also represents that new phase of filmmaking. So it was quite a kind of immediate response to an ongoing political situation. The situation was rather the same in 25th of August 2008. I'd wanted for some time to record a conversation with an Iraqi exile who is a friend of mine. Again, the way in which Iraq was seen in the aftermath of the invasion of 2003 was a complete distortion of the history and the complexity of the country. Its very, very complex history, its importance of its culture, but also the fact that it had a very progressive history. It had had a very large, very active communist party that had been repressed by Saddam Hussein in an appalling kind of purge of the late 70s, when the Iraqi intellectuals were driven into exile. So the film ended up as a monologue for Faisal Abdullah, talking about the question of exile, the problem of the loss of progressive politics in Iraq, and the particular story of his brother as a left-wing intellectual who was invited back to participate in the Ministry of Culture and was ultimately assassinated on the 23rd of August 2008. So there again, the film was a response to a political story that I felt was important to record. I've always wanted to expand that small 25-minute monologue into something more complex. I still hope to, but so far I haven't yet been able to do it.
You would look forward to it. Also, we wanted to know how you look at the idea of film theorizing in a context where there is an accelerated pace of change itself. It's no more a gradual kind of a change.
Yes.
The rate of change itself is accelerating.
Yes.
Like, for instance, if you look at the way in which we consume cinema, the spatial dynamics have radically changed. So it's no more in a common space collectively as a society engaging with the text, but it is something that we can watch in the comfort of our own homes
Yes.
as an individual. And I don't need to look for a screen out there. The screen could be brought in my
Yes,
palm, and I can
exactly.
engage with that. And the content, for that matter, is now so much. They say that if I have to watch the content that is produced and uploaded on YouTube today, I would need, if I have to watch that alone, I would need more than a lifetime.
Yes.
So that's the amount of content that is being produced. And for that matter, anybody who has a phone in hand could probably aspire to be a filmmaker.
Yes.
So the potential is at least there.
Yes.
So there is so much of change that is involved. Could you tell us the difficulty in theorizing in this phase of media explosion?
What I usually say to that is that I'm too old for that question.
Okay.
I'm going to be 80 in 2 years' time. It's too difficult for me to think through these kinds of issues, but I think it's a priority for you, for the younger generation, and for your students. It's possibly one of the most urgent issues of our time. And I was thinking about this a couple of years ago. I was asked to give a paper in Berlin about what they call big data.
Okay.
And that's when I realized, no, I can't think about this. But I thought about the stumbling blocks. So if it would amuse you, I could just tell you what my 3 stumbling blocks were. This is why older people can't grasp this. And I think it relates very much to what you were saying, PK. In the first instance, it's a matter of scale. There's too much of it. And it's very difficult to figure out. In the old days, we used to think about commercial industrial cinema, avant-garde cinema, and so on. Now, there's just a mass.
Yeah.
And the other day, when I was talking about home movies in my lecture here,
Yes.
if we think about the preciousness of those old 16mm frames, now every parent films every child from the moment of its birth, for every second, and it's all up there in the ether somewhere, masses and masses and masses, scale. The second thing I think is very difficult is simultaneity.
Yeah.
Everything happens at once. So there's no gap in
Yes.
which we can stop and think and consider. Everything is at once. You know, everything in social media, young people's interactions. There's no gap between one message and another. It all happens simultaneously. And the other thing, which is perhaps a little bit more difficult to articulate for me, is what I think of as dematerialization. So that perhaps, for instance, instead of having to wait for conversations like we're having here, we can dematerialize our conversations on Skype. A disembodiment, the way in which the body of the digital is obscure to us, whereas in the old days of cinema, you could wander to the back of the cinema, you could look at the projector, you could see the big reels, you could see the frames of film. That materiality is no longer so easily accessible to us. And I just wanted to add a footnote to that, which relates back to the question of the woman as spectacle and the body of the woman. The way in which nowadays the digital is also dematerializing the body of the woman as spectacle. So in the old Hollywood movies, she was spectacle, but there was the body of a movie star, however cosmetic, however made up, however lit. Now she's airbrushed, she's changed, her body is hardly there. And there are certain kinds of fashion displays on video, models, where their bodies are kind of elongated, emaciated, beyond the possibilities of the human. And this reminded me of the way in which there's always been perhaps a dream behind the fetishization of the female body, which is the dematerialization of the female body. So that perhaps the ultimate fetishized fantasy of the female body was the beautiful automaton in the legends and stories of Hoffman's Olympia, and we see it coming back quite symptomatically in very interesting movies that have been made recently today, which pick up on the woman as alien body. Her, can you name any other movies in which the woman is actually an alien or robotic?
Terminator.
Yes, yes. So this dream, in a sense, of the woman as eviscerated also coincides with that patriarchal fantasy that it's possible to take the woman's abject nature out of the image and turn her into some beautiful, dematerialized figure, which will be like a kind of robotic servant to his desires.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing so many such rich and interesting insights with us. And finally, you had also pointed out how visual pleasure and narrative cinema is still relevant in a different way. Be it with it's not as though the questions are done to death. They do still have a great value, more like a palimpsest sort of a one. So the ghosts of the past are still there, and there is something that is also emerging in a newer format, and it is in that kind of a moment that we are, and there is a future with pregnant with plenty of possibilities, and we are looking forward to it as film theorists. Thank you so much, ma'am,
Well,
and
thank you
to
so much to you two for your wonderful questions, and thank you to anybody who listens in the future.